Welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle podcast. I am, as usual, Jodelle, and I literally read my next guest's book in 2 sittings. And only because I started it right before my bedtime, so I had to stick to my bedtime. But then I got up the next day and completely finished it because I couldn't put it down. So this book really floored me, and I had to get him on the podcast. So Dr. Michael Platt has joined me today on my podcast. He is a board-certified internal medicine doctor and specializes in wellness and hormone therapy, and is considered one of the leading experts in managing something that I think is an epidemic right now, which is excess adrenaline and what he refers to as adrenaline dominance, which I love that title. He even has an award-winning published book, which I mentioned, and on this subject, and it's called Adrenaline Dominance, and as well as numerous other books. So I'm excited to talk to you, Dr. Platt. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I have so many questions for you, so I can't wait to dive right in. But I wanted to have you on because in my nutrition practice, I'm constantly seeing this is a major issue, this adrenaline dominance with women specifically, and how it affects hormones, how it affects weight, how it affects so many facets of our life. And so, Dr. Platt, this issue that we're having right now, even this public health issue of coronavirus, I mean, I think there's even some relation there to adrenaline dominance. So I want to pick your brain today and get inside that wonderful, amazing brain of yours on adrenaline dominance. So let's just start right there, Dr. Platt. What is adrenaline dominance?
Well, I think most of your listeners have heard of adrenaline. It's a hormone as well as a neurotransmitter. And most people think of it as what they call the fight or flight hormone. Mm-hmm. And that's true. It is released in high levels when people are in danger, but that's a very small part of what adrenaline actually does. The main function of adrenaline is to make sure the brain has enough fuel. Most people do not realize that the brain uses more sugar than any other part of the body, especially by weight. And when you take sugar away from the brain, that's when people get sleepy. They call that hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. And this can happen when people are driving, and you've heard of people that fall asleep when they're driving, they go off the road, hit a tree, and kill themselves. So you can see from a survival standpoint, the body always wants to make sure the brain has enough fuel. And so anytime the body detects a low level of glucose, sugar, in the brain, it simply puts out adrenaline to raise sugar levels. So that's the primary function of adrenaline, and most people do not realize that. But you can see from that since the brain uses up fuel in about 3 hours, that the body can be releasing adrenaline throughout the day and certainly during the night. In fact, adrenaline peaks at 2:30 in the morning because the brain is out of fuel then. And a lot of people get up at that time to urinate because adrenaline gives people that urge to urinate, not only at night, but during the day when people have that urge when they have to go. That's adrenaline. On television, they call it an overactive bladder.
Right.
And needless to say, they have certain drugs. They have drugs for everything, and they have drugs for that also. So adrenaline dominance is when the body is releasing adrenaline to the point that it really affects the quality of your life. And we'll go over some of those things that happen. So that's basically adrenaline dominance.
Okay, wonderful. Well, in my nutrition therapy practitioner training, there was a required reading that we had, a book that I'm very familiar with over the years, and it's called Adrenal Fatigue. How about I say it right? Adrenal Fatigue of the 21st century. It's this book that's been around the block about adrenal fatigue, and I struggled with that book because while all the symptoms matched up to the people that I was familiar with having adrenal issues, the thing about fatigue bothered me because I thought this is the organ in your body that's designed to keep you alive. So the last thing that's really going to go is the adrenals, in my opinion. They're not going to fatigue, they're going to probably overwork. So when I read your book, I thought this is more in line with what it should be called. It should be called adrenaline dominance, not fatigue. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, you're absolutely correct. Adrenal fatigue is a condition that doesn't exist. It's a non-existent disease. And the reason why they even talk about adrenal fatigue, it's a naturopath diagnosis. And naturopaths, for the most part, do what are called saliva tests when they look at hormones. And when you're dealing, adrenaline is a survival hormone, and part of the survival response is that it cuts off blood supply to areas of the body that are not needed for survival. And, for example, cold hands and cold feet is caused by adrenaline, even though most people think it's a low thyroid, it's adrenaline. And there's another condition called irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. And this is because adrenaline cuts off blood supply to the intestines because they're not needed for survival. But it also cuts off blood supply to the salivary glands. And as a result, hormones do not get into the saliva. So when they do a saliva test and they read that there's a low level of cortisol in the saliva, that's how they make the diagnosis of adrenal fatigue. If they did a blood test, they would find that the cortisol level is actually high, which makes more sense. And so adrenal fatigue is adrenaline dominance. All the symptoms of adrenal fatigue are those of adrenaline dominance.
Yeah, so let's jump right in there. Let's talk about the conditions and the symptoms pertaining to how excess adrenaline affects certain parts of the body. So, like if we were just going to pick a part of the body, you were even saying the salivary glands are affected. I was under the impression, too, that even dry mouth can come from excess adrenaline. Is that correct? Can somebody get dry mouth from not producing enough cells?
Absolutely. People with chronic, anxiety is only caused by excess adrenaline. And people that have chronic anxiety always complain about a dry mouth. And that, again, is because the adrenaline cuts off blood supply to the salivary glands. But if you want to start at the beginning in terms of adrenaline dominance, let's talk about colic in babies.
Yeah.
Colic in babies is caused by excess adrenaline. And that can be eliminated in probably 3 to 5 minutes just by using, and we'll talk about this later, progesterone cream. And putting it on the baby's belly goes away in 3 to 5 minutes. And then the next time that adrenaline rears its head is what they call the terrible twos. It's caused by excess adrenaline. And then a little bit further on, bedwetting. Bedwetting is only caused by excess adrenaline. And then going on a little bit step further, ADHD, again, is only caused by excess adrenaline. And all these conditions that we're going to be talking about are reversible just by lowering adrenaline levels. But talking a little bit more about excess adrenaline and conditions, the number one reason why people have trouble sleeping is excess adrenaline. Some people, they go to sleep, the mind races, that's adrenaline. People that toss and turn, people that grind their teeth at night, people that keep their jaw clenched, people that get up at night to urinate, for the most part, this is adrenaline. And I mentioned ADHD, and here we're looking at millions of people. There's another condition called fibromyalgia, which affects 10 million people in this country, and they've all been told that there's no cure for it because they don't know what causes it, but it is caused by excess adrenaline, and it is curable. But I mentioned irritable bowel syndrome, but it's the number one reason why people get into addiction. Drugs and alcohol is to relax when they have too much adrenaline. And, PTSD, there's another condition called PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is found in women. About 5 to 8% of women that are menstruating have this condition. And again, that's caused by excess adrenaline. If you hear about women that vomit throughout their entire pregnancy, that's also caused by excess adrenaline. Let me know when you want me to stop. The main cause of headaches is excess adrenaline. And tonight it's ringing in the ears. The main cause of that is caused by excess adrenaline. You want more?
Oh, I mean, yeah, the list just goes on and on because it's related to so many different things. And, what I appreciated about your book was I had no idea about the connection with colic. Like I never had heard that. And a lot of what you say in your book is, so you're not hearing this in mainstream. People aren't focusing on adrenaline, and that's why I think it's really key that we talk about it today because there's only one other doctor that I've heard talk about it, and that's Dr. Ray Peat. So you guys are the only ones promoting, look at your adrenaline response. How is your body? How much stress is in your life? Can we dampen that down? And can we use progesterone to help with that? Which I think is it's something that's so going to the root of the cause versus just treating it with a Band-Aid like mainstream medicine is doing. What about the connection with the thyroid?
Well, people have to understand that adrenaline is what they call a stimulant. Mm-hmm. And the thyroid hormone is a stimulant. So when people have a lot of adrenaline, they do not tolerate thyroid. And so when people have a lot of adrenaline, it causes something called stress. And some people may have heard of that, okay, stress. And the body responds to stress by putting out cortisol. And the thing about cortisol, it's an anti-thyroid hormone. So it's not unusual when people have a lot of adrenaline that they're actually low in thyroid. Which is probably the major connection between adrenaline and thyroid. Mm-hmm. So sometimes when you're in a position where somebody has a lot of adrenaline and you lower their adrenaline, that underlying low thyroid kicks in, and all of a sudden they become tired. So it's just something that you have to look at, when you are lowering adrenaline, to make sure that their thyroid is in balance as well. So. Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Platt, do you think it's gotten worse in the last few decades with our exposure to things like artificial light that's in every building and our exposure to smartphones and more technology than ever? Do you think that these devices affect our adrenaline?
People that have a lot of adrenaline do not tolerate those devices that you mentioned.
Okay.
I think they call it EMF or something.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Something
yeah.
So sometimes actually lowering adrenaline levels mm-hmm. takes away their sensitivity to cell phones and Wi-Fi and stuff like this. And but in terms of pollution or global warming and you talk about epidemics, when it comes to adrenaline, to me, I think the biggest change or challenge that has occurred is that there's almost like a worldwide epidemic of low levels of progesterone, which is a hormone.
Agreed.
Most doctors and most people think it's a woman's hormone. They don't realize that men and women have the identical hormones,
right?
Different levels, but exactly the same hormones. And when people have excess adrenaline, it's always because one or both of their parents had excess adrenaline. So it's a genetic type thing. But it seems to be becoming more and more prevalent in terms of the conditions. And so, but, I've been doing hormone, studies long time, probably about 20, 30 years. And I don't ever remember having a patient with a normal progesterone level. I'm just saying. So I think that this may be nature's way of maybe slowing down population growth. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but and who knows? This coronavirus may be another thing about nature trying to take care of overpopulation. Overpopulation is the number one thing that nature will not abide with in any kind of species. So I'm not blaming overpopulation. I'm just saying that nature does its own thing.
Mm-hmm. And as far as like keeping adrenaline high, especially during this time, like you mentioned, the coronavirus, when people are stuck at home and they're a little bit worried about what's going to happen, the uncertainty, the fear behind everything. How does this high adrenaline from fear affect our immunity? Like, I think they need to be a little bit more concerned about lowering their stress than, taking the latest immune booster. It's really the stress, I think, can affect our immune system worse than anything. Do you agree?
Well, I do, but it's sort of like an indirect type thing, because when people are under stress or they have anxiety, the body responds to this by putting out cortisol. That's the anti-stress hormone, that's the anti-anxiety hormone. And, cortisol is not a happy hormone. It's where osteoporosis comes from. It certainly causes weight gain because it raises sugar levels, just like adrenaline. But the whole thing about cortisol is that it's bad for the immune system. It wreaks havoc on the immune system. So indirectly, excess adrenaline, because it does cause a rise in cortisol levels, does affect the immune system. And then in terms of longevity, people talk about anti-aging and whatever. Excess adrenaline shortens what are called telomeres. And telomeres are those things on the end of chromosomes that determine how long a person lives. So the number one thing that shortens that is stress. Or another way of saying adrenaline. Mm-hmm. So adrenaline affects millions and millions of people, but like I said, very rarely ever talked about.
Yeah, it's so fascinating reading your book and seeing how many things correlated with someone who, like myself, I think I have lived with a lot of high adrenaline. I had a mom who was very high adrenaline. She died from cancer at 45, and then I had a father who was an alcoholic. So obviously, based on what you were saying about addiction and stuff, he had very high adrenaline, and he was kind of the adrenaline junkie, always seeking the next high kind of thing. But I think that's, like you said, I think we do inherit it. I think we've become more adrenaline dominant based on our background and how we're raised. And so, the relationship with serotonin, that transmitter in the brain, can you talk about that? Because I feel like these kind of people also have elevated serotonin, and that's where maybe, like your book mentioned, road rage would come in, like kind of that irritation, agitation effect on the brain as well.
Well, yeah, the only thing that causes road rage is excess adrenaline.
Okay.
But again, that's the kind of problem that can be eliminated in 24 hours. You can get rid of road rage in 24 hours. Mm-hmm. People go to anger management class, which is a waste of time. It does nothing for, in terms of helping with road rage. Mm-hmm. But, there are a lot of different types of neurotransmitters. You mentioned serotonin, there's dopamine, and all this kind of things, and they're all interrelated. You're absolutely right about that. But the neurotransmitter that has the most effect on how we feel is adrenaline. I mean, that's the number one. And I think that if you actually control your adrenaline levels, you can control basically all your other neurotransmitters at the same time. People, you may have heard of bipolar disorder, mm-hmm. which is all about adrenaline. And that condition I mentioned before, PMDD, that's found in about, like I say, 5 to 8% of women that are menstruating. And these are the women that for 10 days out of the month, nobody can live with them because they have severe anger issues and severe mood swings. And again, it's put in that category of, we don't know what causes it and there's no cure for it, but it's all about adrenaline. It's easy to take care of. I promise you we'll talk about what your listeners can do later on.
Sure.
But it's important to recognize, when somebody has excess adrenaline. Let's talk a little bit about ADHD, if you don't mind. Sure,
absolutely.
They actually had millions of very young people on drugs, psychoactive drugs, for behavior problems. And look at all the millions of children that are on drugs like Ritalin, Strattera, Adderall, for what they call ADHD. And what people don't realize is that if these children didn't have ADHD, these drugs would actually give it to them because these drugs are pure adrenaline. And what they're doing, they're actually increasing their adrenaline to the point that it numbs the brain. And that's why a lot of these kids don't like these kind of drugs. And needless to say, the part of the side effects is sudden death. Mm. But when it comes to our medical systems, sudden death from drugs is actually an accepted side effect, believe it or not. I'm just saying, I'm not a big fan of our whole pharmaceutical system. But anyway, but the thing about ADHD, people with it are branded as having a learning disorder. And what's interesting is that ADHD is not a learning disorder, it's an interest disorder. People with ADHD, they'll focus on things they're interested in, but if they're not interested, their mind goes so quickly because of the adrenaline that they have trouble focusing and they get distracted very easily. So let me repeat that. ADHD is not a learning disorder, it's an interest disorder. And the most intelligent, successful, creative people in the world have ADHD. So how bad can it be?
Yeah.
In my book, as you know, I talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to adrenaline. And the only condition I put in the good category is ADHD. In fact, the people that are the most successful are the ones that have two different types of ADHD. And you're going to say, well, what are the two different types? Well, people think of ADHD as kids that are hyperactive. Mm-hmm. But then you have these other kids that have trouble focusing, but they're not hyperactive, and they label them as having what's called ADD, attention deficit disorder, without the hyperactivity, without the H. But these kids are actually hyperactive in the brain. And they actually have more adrenaline than kids with ADHD, believe it or not. But these are the ones that I call the creative type ADHDs. Mm-hmm. Their hyperactivity is taken, is sort of manifested by creativity rather than athleticism. And the thing is that you have to remember, I haven't really mentioned, the reason why the body is really putting out adrenaline is just to make sure the brain has sugar. Mm-hmm. So when people have ADD, or what I call a creative type ADHD, they're putting out a lot of sugar, but they're not burning it up like kids with ADHD that are hyperactive. So kids with ADHD never have a weight problem, but kids with ADD have a weight problem because they're making all the sugar, but they're not burning it up. And the whole thing about sugar, it doesn't matter whether you're eating it or the body's making it. If you don't burn it up, the body will store it as fat in your fat cells. And most of the adrenaline is released at night around 2:30 in the morning when people are just lying in bed. Mm-hmm. And then when the body puts out all this adrenaline, which creates stress, then the body puts out cortisol to deal with the stress, and the first thing cortisol does, it also raises sugar levels. Mm-hmm. So while people are sitting, lying in bed, they're making two hormones that raise sugar levels, and they're not burning it up, and it's probably the number one cause of weight gain, and nobody ever talks about it. But again, when we talk about creative people, they have the most adrenaline. If you look at the music industry, and you look at the amount of drugs and alcohol in the music industry, sure. And these are all creative type people. And a lot of these people can afford to go into rehab or detox, to get off the drugs. But nobody's talking about why they're doing drugs and alcohol in the first place. So nobody takes care of their adrenaline problems. So when they leave, they go right back to drugs and alcohol. And a lot of these facilities that deal with rehab, whatever, they're not that interested in looking for the cause because they want repeat customers. That's how they make their money. Mm-hmm. And, our medical system is all based on money. It's a multi-trillion-dollar-a-year industry that thrives on disease and illness. And adrenaline is great for the business of medicine.
I loved when I heard you say that about the sleep issue, because I have felt when I had sleep issues, I had felt for a while that I'm like, this is something else. This isn't like I ate too late, or I didn't do something in the day that I should have, or I'm not releasing enough melatonin. It was this racy feeling of like you could run a marathon in the night, and I could feel my heart on my pillow, and I could get up in the night and do things, and I'm like, I shouldn't be able to do things. I should be sleepy. Why am I getting up? And I always felt like this has to be something to do with adrenaline, and it wasn't until fast forward when I started doing my own research that I'm like, I have to calm down my adrenaline in the night. And so when I read what you had written and I listened to some other podcasts you're on, I'm like, this is the first person talking about the fact that it is an adrenaline response, and the fact that sometimes it takes the individual an hour to an hour and a half to go back to sleep, and that's your body saying, hey, I'm not okay, and if you're not going to help me right now and give me some sugar, I'm going to burn some hard-earned muscle and turn it into sugar so that you can get back to sleep and so that I can do what I need to do. And so I loved when I read that, what you had to say, because I'm like, finally, somebody's getting it, that we need to calm down the adrenaline response in the night. And I think that's key because sleep is such a huge issue right now. And there's many factors that go into it, but this is the main one.
You are, I should have had your picture on my cover of my book. But you are in that creative type category.
Yes.
And since you don't seem to have a weight issue, then you're in the category of what I call the mixed type ADHD, where you have two different types. And again, these are the most successful people in the world to have two different types of ADHD. The heads of every major corporation have two different types of ADHD, and I suspect not one of them ever finished college. They just didn't have the patience or the tolerance for college. They wanted to do things.
Right.
Like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And, yeah. Anyway, but, the thing that really has, I don't know, perplexed me the most about this whole thing is that it's not that complicated an idea. Why hasn't this been brought to the people's attention?
Yeah.
I think part of it, as you probably know, I run into problems with the medical board in California. My first book, the experts for the medical board, they felt the ideas in that book were so dangerous, I shouldn't be practicing medicine. And all the book talks about is treating the underlying cause of illness and getting people off drugs. But at the time that I wrote it, I didn't realize that the medical boards are 100% funded by drug companies. And they had complaints from doctors about me because I was taking their patients off with their medications. And even though drugs are the third leading cause of death, I got in trouble because I took people off drugs. I'm just saying. So
I understand. That's really unfortunate that our system is so into pushing a pill that's just a Band-Aid versus actually going to the root of the issue, which we're going to get to. But before we go there, like you had mentioned weight gain and weight loss. I mean, I think I've seen people kind of the adrenaline body type of people that maybe don't eat and they lose weight. But I've also seen people that I can clearly see their maybe even obesity is from excess adrenaline. Can you talk about that?
Well, these are the creative people. And you'll find that the people that have the most trouble with weight are the creative type people. And in order for them to even start losing weight, they're going to have to learn how to approach it from the standpoint that the body is overproducing adrenaline. And those are usually the easiest people to get to lose weight, believe it or not. It all comes down to treating the cause of the problem. And for what it's worth, doctors are not trained to treat the cause of illness. They just give out Band-Aids. And, you also mentioned that you've had people that did not have weight problems and were not big eaters. And the thing about adrenaline takes away the appetite.
Right, correct.
So a lot of people will find that when they wake up in the morning, they don't have breakfast because they just don't have an appetite. And so they start the day off living on adrenaline because the brain needs fuel. And so it begins. Medicine has always been a passion for me, and getting people well is very rewarding. And so this is something that people can do on their own. They don't need a doctor's advice. Everything we're going to be talking about, they can do on their own. And this might not be a bad time to stay away from doctors' offices because, well, I'm just saying.
Yeah, I know, I agree, for sure. As far as like the one other symptom I had wanted to ask you about was like red eyes or puffy eyes. How do the eyes relate to adrenaline dominance? Do they play a part?
I'm probably not going to be able to address this easily, but excess adrenaline can cause things like glaucoma. It can cause problems with the retina because it constricts blood vessels, and and when you talk about puffy eyes, right, remember people with excess adrenaline can have an underactive thyroid, and an underactive thyroid may be one of the most common reasons why people have fluid underneath the eyes.
Okay.
But in terms of the redness in the eyes, that only if they're like lacking sleep from excess adrenaline, I could see that. Yeah. But I don't think it's a direct effect of adrenaline.
And in your book, you talk about the blood markers on lab tests that identify adrenaline dominance. Can you talk to my listeners about that? Like how would they know if they have it based on their blood markers?
Well, let me start off by saying that when it comes to hormones, I always prefer treating people rather than lab tests. And the reason for that is that hormones change all the time. Right. And you can never go wrong treating a person, but you can be really misled by treating a lab test. However, okay, but if you're looking for the most definitive lab test when it comes to excess adrenaline, it's a morning cortisol, a blood test, not a saliva test, a morning cortisol test. And the reason for that is that when the body releases adrenaline, it creates stress. The body responds to stress by putting out cortisol. So now the normal level of cortisol goes, and with certain labs it goes up to 19.4, and other labs is 23.2. However, when they were determining what a normal level of cortisol was, these tests most lab tests were done in hospitals where they had actually medical students or interns working. And so most of the normal levels are based on doctors' levels. Mm-hmm. And keep in mind that all doctors, or I'd say 99% of them have excess adrenaline. They all have ADHD. All doctors have ADHD. And the thing is, which remember, that's a good thing. Remember, and it's adrenaline that actually gives people intelligence and enhances creativity. So, like I say, it's not a bad thing. So, so when it comes to lab testing, the morning cortisol is the best test to look at. However, anything above 14 should be considered high. You don't go by the range up to 19.4. Anything above 14 is high. So that's one test. Now, another one, you ever hear the term pre-diabetic, that somebody is pre-diabetic? And usually that's based on a lab test called the hemoglobin A1C. I don't know if you've heard of that blood test. Okay. And the hemoglobin A1C is a reflection of sugar in red cells over like a 3-month period of time, because red cells live for about 3 months. Mm-hmm. And so when people have an elevated hemoglobin A1C, which is a reflection of sugar in these red cells, they tell people that they're pre-diabetic. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind that when people are putting out adrenaline to raise sugar levels, this is the most common reason why people have elevated hemoglobin A1Cs. So all these people that they're saying are pre-diabetic are not pre-diabetic, they just have a lot of adrenaline. So to answer your question, so a hemoglobin A1C is another good test to determine if somebody is putting out a lot of adrenaline. Okay, wonderful. That's good to know.
I promise our listeners we are going to get to the good stuff about how to lower adrenaline. Okay. But before we get there, you're just so fascinating. And your book, okay, you talked about Fen-PHen in your book, and I think my mom took Fen-PHen, and I always thought it was like something that you like stand 10 feet away from, but I was amazed at what I read in your book about it. It almost made me want to like wish it was still around to take it. Can you talk about Fen-PHen?
Yeah, Fen-PHen, probably most of your listeners probably too young to remember Fen-PHen, but the Fen-PHen was a combination of phentermine and fenfluramine, two different medications, and both of these drugs were generic, which means that no drug company had a patent on these drugs. And the combination was used to help people lose weight. In fact, in the history of medicine, there's never been anything as effective to get people to lose weight than this combination of two pills. And the reason why they were so effective is because it took away cravings. It put people in 100% control of how they ate. And as long as people continued to eat, they would lose weight. The problem is that there is no drug companies marketing these pills, so doctors didn't have a clue as to what the right dosage should be. So what they would do, they would go to the PDR to look up the dosages, and those are the dosages for the individual pills, not the combination. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that the dosages that doctors use were too high, and the problem is it took away people's appetite, so they weren't eating. And when you stop eating, your metabolism stops, and so their patients weren't losing weight. So what a doctor is going to do? Keep on increasing the dosage. So what happened was the drug companies in general wanted Fen-PHen off the market because it did a lot of things other than weight loss. And so they did one study, and what they did, they rounded up 24 women from around the country that were taking 18 times the normal dose of the drug, 18 times the normal dose. And these are the only patients that developed heart valve problems. But because of this study, which was such an irrational study, the FDA took it off the market. But keep in mind that the FDA is there to protect drug companies. It's not there to protect the consumers. It's there to protect drug companies. And so that's what happened to, and out of all the people, of the millions of people that took Fen-PHen, there are only 5 deaths involved, all right? As opposed to, there was a drug for arthritis, drawing blank with the Z something, anyway, that killed like 85,000 people, and that drug wasn't taken off the market until there was a big hullabaloo about it. And there are other drugs where hundreds of thousands of people have died that they left on the market. Here, 5 people died and they took it off the market. But these were people that are on 18 times the normal dose. Okay. And, but aside from that, there are virtually no side effects. And the thing about Fen-PHen, it took away, not only did it help people lose weight extremely effectively, in fact, it was the only thing they ever had that was good for the morbidly obese. But it also lowered blood pressure better than anything they had on the market, and it took away migraine headaches, and it took away asthma, and it actually helped a lot of medical conditions. That's why they wanted it off the market. They remember, these are just 2 drugs that were not patented. Anyway, so but it took away cravings not only for food, but for alcohol, cocaine, heroin, cigarettes. In 24 hours, people were off every one of these drugs. It was a remarkable combination. Anyway.
And so you felt like did it have some relationship with lowering adrenaline?
It blocked adrenaline.
Okay, yeah.
It did everything that we're doing now to help block adrenaline. But anyway, yeah, I think that they should at least let it back on the market just for the morbidly obese, the 400, 500-pound people. They have nothing for these people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I found that fascinating. That was a really interesting part of the book. And, you mentioned in there that people could take beta blockers. I mean, that blocks adrenaline too, but oh my gosh, look at the laundry list of side effects of taking a beta blocker,
Exactly.
So there are much better ways to do it, which we're going to get into. So let's talk about that, Dr. Platt.
Okay. So if somebody has excess adrenaline, you have to go back to the reason why the body's putting out adrenaline. Now remember, it's to increase sugar levels for the brain. So right away, what that tells people is that if they give the brain the kind of fuel that it requires, the body doesn't have to use adrenaline to provide the fuel. Now, what makes it relatively simple, first of all, there are only 2 reasons why the body puts out adrenaline. One is if you're in danger, and the other is just to provide fuel to the brain. So the brain uses 2 different fuels. One is glucose, and the other are ketones. And the best source of glucose for the brain comes from vegetables. Now you're going to say, well, wait a minute, Doc, what about candy and soda? Aren't they great sources of glucose? Well, they are. There's no question they produce a lot of glucose, but it's the kind of glucose that produces a lot of insulin. Mm-hmm. And so these are considered what are called high glycemic foods. High glycemic means they produce a lot of insulin. The thing about vegetables is that they're low glycemic. They produce very little insulin. In fact, green vegetables produce no insulin at all. They're 0 glycemic. So that's why people that have a weight issue can eat a lot of vegetables and not have, or at least green vegetables, and not have a problem. Mm-hmm. So that's why vegetables are the best source of glucose for the brain. And then when it comes to ketones, people, they talk about a ketogenic diet, which I don't recommend only because it's a very hard diet to do. The Atkins diet was a ketogenic diet and was very successful, and the Stillman diet. And so it's not a new concept. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to be on a ketogenic diet to get ketones. Coconut oil is a great source of ketones. And then you have MCT oil, which is made from coconut oil, which is another even better source of ketones. So if people are providing the brain with ketones and glucose from vegetables, within 24 hours, they can have a significant drop in adrenaline levels. That's why you can get rid of bedwetting in children in 24 hours. You know, people deal with that for years. And then, so those are the two fuels that the brain needs. And then the icing on the cake is using a 5% progestin cream. The reason I mentioned 5% means that each pump is 50 milligrams. And 50 milligrams is the exact strength you need to block adrenaline. So people that are eating correctly and using a progestin cream, a 5% progestin cream, can get immediate, first of all, they get immediate relief just by using the cream because it blocks adrenaline right away. And then when you start lowering the adrenaline levels, you know, within 24 hours, they're sleeping better, their road rage disappears, they don't, it changes their life.
Yeah, and I was so glad to hear you mention about, you know, not doing keto, and for obvious reasons, not just that it's hard for some people to do, but also if the brain needs sugar, and the body's definitely going to turn to making sugar, then it stands to reason that we need carbohydrates. We need things that turn to sugar in the body just to keep the adrenaline down. So, I mean, it makes common sense, too.
Thank you. And the other thing that people have to keep in mind, you know, a lot of people that are concerned about weight, you know, they do exercise. You know, I'm probably not the one to talk about exercise because my form of exercise is to walk to my car. But when people exercise, their muscles are also burning glucose, the same fuel that the brain needs. And so people, you know, very often they're dieting during the day, they're exercising during the day, and they don't lose weight. It's because they're gaining weight while they're sleeping. You know, because again, the brain needs that glucose that they've already used up exercising.
And see, folks, 2 different doctors saying that it doesn't take these large amounts of exercise to lose weight. Like Dr. Pete says the same thing. He says that exercise actually puts more of a stressor on your system. And so, yeah, and if I do any sort of a workout that day, I always make sure I have plenty of carbohydrates to counteract that exercise because I know it's robbing from my brain. So that's so good to hear you say that. So these are common sense ways that if people can change a few things in their food, they can change a few things as far as like how they're keeping that sugar in and maybe lowering some of the high intensity exercise down. So, and then the progesterone, I mean, those are simple things they can do. So what are there other things? Are there other supplements that you recommend that help with adrenaline? Like what about magnesium?
Well, magnesium is good for a lot of different things. You know, right now people should be using a lot of vitamin D because it's good for the immune system. But if they're on vitamin D, they should also be on magnesium because you need, you know, a certain amount of magnesium to be able to absorb the vitamin D. But in terms of weight loss, there's very little extra that they need to do. Like, you know, you know, if they're eating correctly, you know, the right fuels and using the progesterone, that basically they're key to weight loss. And it doesn't hurt to have a certain number of supplements that are healthy for the body. But in terms of weight loss, this should do it. Now, when it comes to progesterone, you know, I mentioned the 5% cream, you know, and I just want to say that, you know, the best place usually to apply it is on the forearm. You put a pump on the forearm, you rub the 2 arms together. But a lot of people that have excess adrenaline carry a lot of tension to the back of the neck. And so the back of the neck is a great place to put progesterone cream. People that have ringing in the ears, tinnitus, it can very often get rid of it within just about 10 minutes. The ringing goes away. People that, you know, you've heard the term migraine headaches. And, you know, it's interesting, you know, throughout my career, I've had a number of patients that have thought they had migraine headaches, but every time I've had a patient that thought they had a migraine headache, they didn't have migraine headaches. They had something called occipital neuritis, which causes severe type headaches, always mistaken for migraines, but occipital neuritis is only caused by excess adrenaline. It comes from the occipital nerve sheath at the base of the skull, and it very often the pain shoots right into the back of the eye or right above it. And again, just using progesterone cream eliminates those headaches. People that have restless leg syndrome is also caused by excess adrenaline. You just rub it into the top of the thighs, goes away in 30 seconds. People that have cramps in their calves or their feet, again, this is caused by excess adrenaline. And that goes away in about 30 seconds just by massaging it in. And again, let me repeat something I said in the beginning about cold hands and cold feet are only caused by excess adrenaline. Even though it's, that's blamed on the thyroid, but it says excess adrenaline. So,
and you mentioned that men have this too. We're not just talking women. Women, it's probably more specific to in mainstream, but men can benefit from progesterone cream too. Is it the same dosage, even though they don't require maybe as much as women?
The same dosage is for everybody, including babies.
Really?
The babies that are newborn, the same 50 milligrams per, because now keep in mind that when the fetus is in the womb, it gets exposed to incredibly high levels of progesterone. Yeah. I mean, levels that cannot be duplicated. Mm-hmm. So you figure if a fetus can tolerate that much progesterone, then certainly men can also. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I don't look at it from the size of the person. I just look at it from the standpoint of the hormone that you're trying to treat. Mm-hmm. And 50 milligrams is the dose they need to block the levels of adrenaline.
And you mentioned timing on progesterone, like around meals is something that you might want to mention too.
When people have a lot of adrenaline, I usually recommend that they use it right before they eat. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that as soon as people put food in the mouth, the body is putting out insulin. And insulin, whenever insulin levels go up, blood sugar drops. And when blood sugar drops, the body will be putting out adrenaline to raise your sugar level back up again. So one way of controlling adrenaline is to control insulin. So, and what's interesting is insulin and adrenaline are the two hormones that raise blood pressure. Mm-hmm. So again, this helps with blood pressure. And also, it helps with people with diabetes because they have insulin issues. And going one step further, in terms of like side effects of progesterone, it basically there's only one side effect. And you may have heard of something called type 3 diabetes. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, saying type 3 diabetes is almost the same thing as saying Alzheimer's disease because they consider type 3 diabetes another way of saying Alzheimer's. But the thing is that type 3 diabetes is when people have what's called insulin resistance in the brain, which means that the insulin in the brain has a real hard time getting glucose into the brain. And one of the benefits of progesterone is that it actually does cause some degree of insulin resistance, which is good because it prevents people from getting sleepy in the afternoon when insulin peaks and prevents people from getting sleepy when they're driving. I myself used to have to slap my face when I was driving, trying to keep my eyes open. And ever since I've been using progesterone, I have never, ever had an episode of sleepiness when driving. So, but if somebody already has insulin resistance and they use progesterone, it increases the insulin resistance. It makes it even harder for the insulin to get glucose into the brain. And the body responses by right away putting out more adrenaline. So the one side effect that can happen when people are using progesterone is that they can actually have an increase in adrenaline. Now, what the good part of this is that it wakens them to the fact that they might have insulin resistance in the brain, which is a precursor to Alzheimer's. And the whole thing about Alzheimer's is it's a disease of prevention. Mm-hmm. So if you know that you have Alzheimer's or you're going to be getting it, you can prevent it or actually just by giving the brain ketones. Mm-hmm. And but anyway, but aside from that, there's no downside to it. A lot of people talk about progesterone causing weight gain.
Okay.
And it's a thermogenic hormone. It helps the body to burn fat, as opposed to like estrogen is a lipogenic hormone that creates fat. But, a lot of people that make progesterone, they recommend that people put it over the abdomen or the inner thighs. You don't want to put it over fatty tissue because it actually increases fat.
Okay.
So you want it in the bloodstream, and that's why the forearm is good because there's an excellent blood supply in the and the skin is thin, so it goes directly into the bloodstream. So doing that, it will not cause weight gain.
Oh, that's good to know. You made me think of something when you were talking, and I want to go back to like the ADHD thing, also with regard to OCD. Okay, so I have a couple of clients that have obsessive compulsive disorder. Does that play into adrenaline as well?
It does. And, people do obsessive behavior to prevent themselves from feeling anxious, prevent themselves from having anxiety. So it only happens when people have excess adrenaline and they have all this anxiety. So OCD is only found in people that have excess adrenaline. So yes, so these people should be on progesterone and eating correctly.
Okay, that's wonderful. So real life solutions here about what people can do. I know you have a protocol that you give to people and that you offer on your website. That's low glycemic meal plan. Even in your book, you actually have a sample day of eating and some food suggestions in there too, which I thought was really great. So where can people find all of this? How can they get in touch with you? And I think I know what you're about to say, and it's phenomenal the way that you deal with people. I've never met a doctor that offers what you're offering, so I'm just going to prepare them ahead of time for what you're going to say.
Well, I have a website.
Yes.
And it's plattwellness.com.
Yes.
And I have a progesterone cream, a 5% progesterone cream. And also there's a hormone evaluation if they want that they can take, and they can always get in touch with me to get the results. But they can also call the office, and I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but when people call the office, if nobody's here, it'll go straight through to my cell phone. So I'm always available to answer questions, and pleased to do so. If they question about hormones or progesterone, or you want to talk about Trump or whatever it is. They can call me.
Well, I can attest to that, because when I emailed you about the podcast, you called me back, and not a lot of people call me back. They email me back, or they wait months and months before contacting me. So you are a genuine human, and what you say you do, and I think people should really value someone who has the wisdom and the expertise and also the genuineness that you have. So I really appreciate that.
Getting people well is very rewarding. I in my book I talk about a fellow that came in, and the reason he came to my office was because every morning he would wake up and vomit, and which is probably not a pleasant thing to do every morning. But the only thing that causes that is excess adrenaline, so it's not hard to diagnose. And he also had some very severe fibromyalgia, and which again is caused by excess adrenaline. And so I put some progesterone cream on his arm, and he rubbed his arms together, and we started talking again. And after about 5 minutes, he sat back in the chair, and he looked at me, and he said, "Doc, in my entire life, I've never felt this good." And that's after 5 minutes. Yeah. And since he left my office, he's never had another episode of vomiting. His fibromyalgia went away. Like I said, getting people well is very rewarding. It really is. And it's a simple matter of just treating the reason why they're not well. It's not a complex, But like I say, doctors are not trained to treat the cause of illness, because they're trained by drug companies who don't want doctors to know the cause of illness.
And we need more people like you who are passionate about helping other people. So that's why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because I think we're like-minded in the fact that we just want to get the truth out so that people don't have to rely on mainstream medicine. There are answers. You can get to the root of the problem, and you can correct the problem. And I really appreciate your time today, Dr. Platt. You've been awesome.
Well, as you know, this is something Hippocrates said thousands of years ago. This is nothing new.
That's right.
So.
Correct. Well, thank you again for your time, and I hope to do this again. I actually ordered your book, The Miracle of Bioidentical Hormones, so I am anxious to dive into that, and maybe we'll have to have another podcast on that as well.
I'm pretty much available. So.
Okay.
But thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for your time, and we will see you soon. We'll do this again. Thank you. Hey out there. So you've heard me talk a lot about F-bombs, dropandfbomb.com.
you may know they have nut butter packets, oil packets like avocado oil and olive oil for on the go, these handy little packets. But did you know that they now have, let me show you the right way, Fen-PHen Keto Crunch, and my daughter, my toddler, loves these. So these are little cheese crisps, and they're made from dairy that's without growth hormone, no artificial flavors, no gluten. They're wonderful. If not for you, then for the little one in your life to take on the go with you.